What did the men who fought the bloodiest war in human history truly think of one another? When German soldiers first crossed the Soviet border on the morning of June 22, 1941, they carried with them not just their weapons and their orders, but a set of beliefs so deeply ingrained that they seemed almost unquestionable. They had been told by their generals, by their propaganda, by the ideological drumbeat of the Nazi regime, that the Red Army was a hollow force, that Soviet soldiers were racially inferior, poorly led, and incapable of mounting any serious resistance against the finest military machine in the world. They believed it. Most of them genuinely, wholeheartedly believed it. And then the war began. What followed over the next 4 years was one of the most dramatic and violent transformations of military perception in the entire history of armed conflict. The image of the Soviet soldier in the eyes of the German fighting man evolved from something approaching contempt to something approaching dread, with every conceivable emotion in between, including grudging admiration, bewilderment, respect, hatred, and fear. In this video, we are going to take a deep dive into the minds of the German soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front, exploring what they truly thought of the men and women standing across from them on the other side of the most catastrophic conflict the world has ever seen. We will look at their letters home, their diaries, their memoirs, the testimonies they gave after the war, and the accounts recorded by historians who spent decades piecing together the human reality behind the statistics. From the opening hours of Operation Barbarossa to the final days in the ruins of Berlin, we will trace the extraordinary journey of how German soldiers came to understand, fear, and in many cases, deeply respect the Soviet soldier, the man they called Ivan. So, without further ado, let's start at the very beginning. Before a single shot was fired on the Eastern Front, the German soldier's view of his future Soviet opponent was shaped by forces that had been building for years. The Nazi racial ideology that permeated every aspect of life in Germany portrayed the Slavic peoples of the Soviet Union as Untermenschen, a word that translates roughly as subhumans, people who stood below the fully human races in some imagined biological hierarchy. This was not a fringe belief whispered in dark corners. It was official state doctrine, taught in schools, repeated in newspapers, hammered home in every piece of propaganda the regime produced. The soldiers who would carry out Operation Barbarossa had grown up breathing this ideological air, and many of them had absorbed it completely. When they looked east toward the Soviet Union, they did not see a nation of 300 million people with a rich culture, centuries of military history, and one of the largest armies in the world. They saw, or thought they saw, a primitive and chaotic mass of humanity, barely held together by Jewish Bolshevik commissars and utterly incapable of standing against German military genius. This contempt had a military dimension that went beyond ideology. The performance of the Red Army in the Winter War against Finland, which lasted from November 1939 to March 1940, had been genuinely dismal. The Soviets had eventually won, but they had done so at staggering cost, and against a tiny nation with a fraction of their resources. The Finnish army had been able to hold off and in many cases humiliate Soviet forces for months, revealing shocking deficiencies in Soviet command, coordination, and basic tactical competence. German military analysts studying the Winter War with professional interest drew conclusions that seemed entirely reasonable based on the evidence they could see. The Red Army had been gutted by Stalin's Great Purge of 1937 and 1938, which had eliminated or imprisoned an estimated 35,000 officers, including 3. Of the 5 Red Army marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and 154 of 186 divisional commanders. It was a decapitation of military leadership so catastrophic that it seemed almost designed to destroy the fighting effectiveness of the force. German analysts knew this. They factored it into their planning. What they could not know or chose not to see was how rapidly the Soviet system was learning from its mistakes and rebuilding. The German military leadership approached Operation Barbarossa with a confidence that, in retrospect, borders on the delusional. General Franz Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, noted in his diary that the entire Russian colossus would prove to be a pig's bladder, meaning it would burst when you pricked it. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel estimated the campaign would be over in 8 to 10 weeks. General Erich Marx, the planner of the initial Barbarossa. Concept calculated that the decisive military operations would be complete within 9 to 17 weeks. Hitler himself famously told his generals that when you kick in the door, the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. These were not the idle boasts of politicians. They were the considered professional judgments of experienced military officers who had spent their careers studying the art of war. They believed what they were saying, and so did the soldiers who crossed the border at 4 a.m. on June 22, 1941, carrying with them the absolute certainty that they were marching to a quick and inevitable victory. The opening days of Operation Barbarossa seemed to confirm everything the Germans believed. The statistics of those first weeks were staggering and one-sided in the extreme. The Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,800 Soviet aircraft on the first day alone, the vast majority of them on the ground. German armoured columns drove deep into Soviet territory at speeds that seemed almost impossible. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, covered hundreds of miles in the first 2 weeks. The encirclements at Minsk and Bialystok trapped and destroyed entire Soviet armies. The prisoners were counted in the hundreds of thousands. By early July, the Germans had taken over 300,000 prisoners in a single operation. By the time Operation Barbarossa reached its first major phase, the encirclement battles of the summer of 1941 had trapped and destroyed Soviet forces on a scale that had no parallel in military history. At Kiev alone, in September 1941, the Germans captured over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The figures were so large that even the Germans themselves had difficulty processing them. And through all of this, the conviction held. The Soviet Union was indeed crumbling. The rotten structure was indeed falling. But even in those first triumphant weeks, even as the prisoners were being marched west in their hundreds of thousands and the panzer columns were driving east at breathtaking speed, certain German soldiers were noticing things that did not fit the expected picture. They were encountering resistance of a kind they had not anticipated. Not everywhere, not consistently, and certainly not on a scale that threatened the overall German advance. But in specific places, at specific moments, Soviet soldiers were fighting with a ferocity and a determination that caught the Germans completely off guard. A private named Wilhelm Prüller wrote in his diary in July 1941 that the Russians were not fighting like any enemy he had encountered before. He noted that they fought until literally the last man was dead. They didn't surrender. They kept firing from positions that had been surrounded and should have been taken hours before. They died at their guns rather than raise their hands. This was not what the propaganda had prepared him for. The Poles had fought bravely. The French had mounted fierce resistance at certain points. But there was something different about this. Something he couldn't quite name. What Prüller and thousands of other German soldiers were encountering in those first weeks was the beginning of a truth that would take years to fully understand. The Red Army was an organization that had been catastrophically damaged but not destroyed. It was hemorrhaging men and equipment at rates that seemed impossible to sustain. It was losing battles on a scale that would have broken most armies. But it was not breaking. And the men who made it up, the ordinary Soviet soldiers who were dying by the hundreds of thousands in those summer encirclements, were fighting back with a stubbornness that refused to be processed through the lens of Nazi racial theory. They were not supposed to fight like this. The Untermenschen were not supposed to stand in their burning tanks and keep firing. They were not supposed to mount counterattacks against superior German positions. They were not supposed to die rather than surrender. But they were doing all of these things, and the German soldiers watching them were left with a dissonance they could not yet fully resolve. General Gunther von Blumentritt, who served as a senior staff officer on the Eastern Front, later wrote that from the very first day of the campaign, it was clear that the Russians were a fundamentally different kind of opponent from anything the German army had faced in the West. He noted that even soldiers who had been completely cut off, who had no hope of rescue or relief, who had been surrounded for days without food or water, continued to fight. He described it as something beyond normal military training, something that seemed to come from a different place entirely. He didn't have a name for it at the time. Later, after the war, looking back at everything that had happened, he would come to call it simply the Russian character. But in the summer of 1941, what he and his colleagues experienced it as was surprise. Pure, unsettling, increasingly troubling surprise. The equipment that Soviet soldiers carried and used in those early months also began to undermine German assumptions in ways that the ideological framework simply could not explain. The German soldiers had expected to encounter obsolete weapons, poor technology, the cast-offs of an inferior civilization. In some respects, their expectations were met. Many Soviet soldiers in 1941 were equipped with outdated rifles, and the logistical and organizational chaos of the Red Army meant that some units went into battle woefully undersupplied. But alongside these genuine weaknesses came shocks that no one in the German military had predicted. The Katyusha rocket launcher, a multiple rocket system mounted on the back of a truck, made its combat debut in July 1941 and produced a psychological impact on German soldiers that went far beyond its physical destructiveness. The weapon could fire a salvo of rockets in seconds, covering a wide area with screaming, flame-trailing projectiles that came from nowhere and disappeared before any response was possible. German soldiers who experienced their first Katyusha barrage described it in terms that were almost theological. It was like the earth opening up, like the sky falling. The sound alone, that distinctive wail that gave the weapon its nickname Stalin's organ, was enough to send experienced veterans diving for cover in a blind panic. And this was a weapon that the supposedly primitive and technologically backward Soviet state had developed, produced, and deployed. It did not fit the picture. Nothing, however, compared to the shock of the T-34. The moment German soldiers first encountered the Soviet T-34 medium tank, everything they thought they knew about the relative balance of military technology between the two nations was thrown into doubt. German anti-tank guns that had made short work of French and British armour found themselves unable to penetrate the T-34's sloped armour at anything but point-blank range. German tanks that outmatched anything they had faced in the West found themselves vulnerable to a Soviet vehicle that was faster, better armoured, and in many respects better designed than their own. Panzer Regiment 18, encountering T-34s for the first time in July 1941, sent urgent reports back to headquarters describing an enemy tank against which their standard weapons were essentially useless. The psychological impact was enormous. These were not the primitive rust buckets of an inferior civilization. These were formidable weapons built by engineers who knew exactly what they were doing. For German tank crews who had crossed the border, confident of their technological superiority, the realization that the Soviets had produced a tank that was superior to most of what Germany had available was a profound and disturbing revelation. But it was not just the equipment. It was what the Soviet soldiers did with that equipment and what they did without it that truly began to shift German perceptions in those early months. German soldiers were encountering acts of individual courage and collective determination that defied every category their training and ideology had prepared them to apply. At the Brest fortress, which straddled the Soviet-Polish border and was overrun in the very first hours of the invasion, pockets of Soviet defenders held out for weeks. The fortress had been expected to fall within hours. The Germans took it quickly in operational terms, but isolated groups of soldiers, sailors, and their families continued to fight in the ruins for weeks afterward. The last documented resistance at the Brest fortress came over a month after the invasion began. Major Pyotr Gavrilov, who commanded one of the last pockets of resistance, was captured in late July in a state of extreme emaciation, but still fighting. He had been living on rainwater and scraps for weeks, and he was still pulling the trigger. German soldiers who witnessed this kind of resistance did not know what to make of it. It was impressive. It was also, in a way they were just beginning to understand, deeply frightening. And what about the Soviet soldiers themselves, the ones who were being killed and captured in those enormous encirclements of 1941? What did the Germans see when they looked at the prisoners streaming west along the dusty summer roads? This is where the contrast between German expectations and German experience becomes most stark and most revealing. The German soldiers expected to see cowering, demoralized men, happy to be out of a hopeless fight, eager to cooperate with their captors, the relieved survivors of a chaotic and incompetent army that had never deserved to stand against Germany. And in some cases, in the early months, something like this was visible. There were Soviet soldiers who surrendered gladly, who were starving and frightened and utterly exhausted, who had been abandoned by their officers and were simply trying to stay alive. The chaos of those first Soviet defeats was real and profound. But alongside this, German soldiers saw something else. They saw men who had nothing, who had been walking for days, who were sick and wounded and starving, who had been beaten on every front and encircled and cut off from all hope of rescue, and who still looked at their captors with an expression that was not defeat. It was not fear. Some of the Germans found it hard to describe. One soldier wrote in his diary that the prisoners looked at them not like men who had lost, but like men who were simply waiting. He didn't know what they were waiting for. He found it unsettling. What these German soldiers were seeing, without yet being able to fully understand it, was the quality that would define the Soviet soldier throughout the war. It was not tactical brilliance. It was not superior equipment, at least not in 1941. It was not superior leadership, which remained deeply flawed for much of the conflict. It was something more fundamental than any of these things. It was endurance, the capacity to absorb punishment that would have broken other armies and to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep resisting. Stalin had a phrase for what he wanted from his soldiers, though it was brutal in its simplicity. He wanted them to stand and die rather than retreat, and with terrifying frequency, that is exactly what they did. A German officer named Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach wrote after the war that what distinguished the Soviet soldier from all others he had encountered was not intelligence or training or skill, though these things improved dramatically as the war went on, but the sheer unquantifiable capacity to endure. He described watching Soviet soldiers continue to function, to fight, to resist, in conditions that he believed would have rendered any German unit completely combat ineffective. He wrote it with respect. He also wrote it with something that bordered on dread. The question of Soviet leadership and what German soldiers made of it is one of the most complex and fascinating threads running through the German perception of their Eastern opponents. In the early months of the war, German soldiers had ample opportunity to observe what poor Soviet leadership looked like, because the catastrophic failures of the Soviet command system in 1941 were on full display. Entire armies were encircled because their commanders could not or would not retreat when retreat was the only rational option. Units were thrown into frontal attacks against prepared positions at enormous cost for minimal gain. The rigid centralized command system that Stalin imposed on the Red Army, where initiative was dangerous and deviation from orders could mean execution, produced tactical decisions that the Germans found bewildering in their inflexibility. German soldiers could see in the attacks being launched. Against them, the hallmarks of a command culture where officers were afraid to think and simply followed orders regardless of the tactical situation. It confirmed, at least on the surface, the German belief that the Soviet system was fundamentally incapable of producing the kind of flexible, initiative-based military thinking that the Wehrmacht prized above all else. But then there were the other moments. The moments when Soviet commanders, usually at the lower levels where the strangling centralization was less complete, showed a tactical instinct that the Germans could not dismiss. The moments when a Soviet unit that should have been easy to destroy simply refused to be destroyed, not because of orders from above, but because of something in the men themselves. The moments when a Soviet soldier, cut off from his unit, without orders, without leadership, without hope, made a decision that showed exactly the kind of individual initiative that the German military had always believed was beyond the Slavic character. These moments were, in the early months, scattered and exceptional, but they were there, and the German soldiers who experienced them noted them in letters and diaries with a mixture of surprise and unease. The picture was more complicated than the ideology had promised. It was becoming clear, even in those early triumphant months of the war, that what awaited Germany in the East was not a simple march through a collapsing primitive structure, but something far more formidable, far more resilient, and far more dangerous. As the summer of 1941 gave way to autumn, and the German advance continued to push deeper into the Soviet Union, the process of reassessment that had begun in those first surprising weeks accelerated. The sheer scale of what the German army was engaged in began to impose its own reality on the ideological frameworks that soldiers had brought to the front with them. Men who were fighting every single day, who were watching their comrades die, who were conducting operations in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, did not have the luxury of maintaining comfortable abstractions. The Soviet soldier in front of them was not an ideological category. He was a human being who was trying to kill them, and the German soldiers were forced to engage with that reality on its own terms. The letters that German soldiers sent home in this period provide one of the most extraordinary windows into the evolving German perception of the Soviet enemy. The German military mail system functioned with surprising reliability throughout much of the war, and millions of letters crossed from the Eastern Front back to Germany. These letters were subject to military censorship, but the censors were generally looking for operational security breaches rather than ideological deviation, and so soldiers were able to write with considerable frankness about what they were experiencing. What emerges from these letters, taken as a body, is a story of continuous reassessment. The confident dismissal of the Soviet soldier that characterized the letters of the early summer gives way over the following months to something more complicated. Soldiers began writing about a specific quality in their opponents that they struggled to name but kept returning to. They wrote about the Soviet soldiers' apparent indifference to death, not in a careless or undisciplined way, but in a manner that seemed almost philosophical. One soldier from the 6th Infantry Division wrote to his wife in October 1941 that he had never in his life seen men who cared so little about dying. He meant it not as praise but as an observation that filled him with a kind of vertigo. These were men, he wrote, who simply did not seem to be afraid in the way that human beings were supposed to be afraid. "What do you do," he asked his wife, "against men like that?" Other letters grappled with the tactical reality of what German soldiers were encountering. The Red Army of 1941, battered and chaotic as it was, had developed certain defensive techniques that proved remarkably effective against the German advance. Soviet soldiers were extraordinarily skilled at using terrain in ways that maximized their defensive advantages. They dug in with a speed and thoroughness that impressed German soldiers who were themselves excellent at field engineering. They created interlocking fields of fire that turned every forest, every village, every riverbank into a potential killing ground. They used the vast spaces of the Russian landscape with an instinctive understanding that came from a lifetime of living in that landscape. A German corporal named Hans Becker wrote to his family in November 1941 that the Russians were like ghosts. You could sweep through an area, convince yourself it was clear, and then find that men had risen out of the ground to cut off the unit behind you. He wrote about discovering Soviet soldiers who had been hiding in haystacks, in cellars, under the ice of a frozen pond for days at a time, waiting for the moment to strike. These were not the tactics of an inferior army, he noted. These were the tactics of men who were fighting on their own ground and who knew it in ways that the Germans never could. The question of what Soviet soldiers thought of their own situation and how that informed their fighting was something that German soldiers tried to puzzle out throughout the war. The political commissars, those Communist Party officials embedded in Red Army units whose job was to enforce ideological commitment and report on any signs of disloyalty, were figures of particular fascination and disgust to the Germans. The famous Commissar Order, issued by the German High Command in June 1941, directed German forces to execute any commissars taken prisoner, categorizing them as enemies outside the protection of the laws of war. This order was widely, though not universally, followed, and its existence tells us something important about how the Germans understood the role of political coercion in motivating Soviet soldiers. The German assumption embedded in the Commissar Order itself was that Soviet soldiers were essentially fighting under compulsion, held in line by the threat of execution from behind as much as by any genuine commitment to the cause. The Commissar was the embodiment of this compulsion, the political bully who kept the hapless Soviet soldier in the fight by threatening consequences more immediate than anything the Germans could deliver. But German soldiers who spent time actually observing Soviet behavior in combat began to develop a more nuanced and in some ways more troubling view. Yes, Soviet soldiers fought under extraordinary coercive pressure. Blocking units, NKVD detachments placed behind the front lines with orders to shoot any soldier who retreated without orders, were a real and terrifying feature of Red Army operations. Stalin's Order 227, issued in July 1942 and known as Not One Step Back, formalized this coercion in the most explicit terms possible. German soldiers knew about these measures, and some derived a certain comfort from the idea that it was fear rather than genuine fighting spirit that kept their opponents in the field. But the comfort was illusory, because again and again German soldiers encountered Soviet troops who fought with a passion and commitment that went far beyond any calculation of consequences. Men who charged German positions with nothing more than a bayonet and a scream. men who detonated grenades against German tanks, taking themselves with them, men who, when their ammunition was exhausted, fought with entrenching tools and their bare hands. The coercive framework explained some of what the Germans saw. It didn't explain all of it, not even close. One of the aspects of the Soviet soldier that most consistently surprised and unnerved German troops was the physical endurance that their opponents displayed. German soldiers were themselves drawn from a highly militarized society that placed enormous value on toughness and physical capability, and they had been extraordinarily well trained by the standards of any military force in the world. But the Soviet soldiers' capacity for physical hardship exceeded anything the Germans had experienced or prepared for. Soviet soldiers could march distances that German planners considered impossible. They could survive on food that German soldiers would have found insufficient to sustain basic function. They could endure cold that incapacitated German units, not because they had better equipment, though Soviet winter clothing was eventually superior, but because they had an ingrained relationship with extreme cold that was simply part of life in the regions they came from. A soldier from Siberia or central Russia had grown up in conditions that would have seemed extraordinary to a German from Bavaria or Prussia. The harsh Russian winter that became one of the great catastrophes of the German war effort was, for many Soviet soldiers, simply home. This physical dimension of the Soviet soldier's character produced a specific kind of German response that evolved from contempt to a grudging and troubled form of admiration. In the early months, German soldiers sometimes wrote about the hardiness of their opponents in terms that reflected the racial ideology they had absorbed, describing Soviet soldiers as animal-like in their tolerance for hardship, their apparent indifference to comfort, their capacity to function in conditions where a civilized man would collapse. This was the ideology speaking, trying to fit observation into its pre-existing categories. But as the war went on, and the Germans themselves were forced to endure conditions they had never imagined, the framing shifted. Men who were themselves freezing, starving, physically exhausted in ways they had not thought possible, began to describe the Soviet soldiers' endurance in different terms, not as animal insensitivity, but as a kind of superhuman resilience, something to be respected, even feared. Lieutenant Colonel Hans von Luck, who served in North Africa and then on the Eastern Front, wrote after the war that the Soviet soldiers' physical capacity was not something that could be explained by ideology or coercion. It came from somewhere deeper, from the land itself, from a culture that had always asked its ordinary people to endure the unendurable. He found it remarkable. He also found it terrifying. The role of Soviet women in the war was another element that consistently shocked and disturbed German soldiers in ways they found difficult to process. The Soviet Union deployed women in combat roles on a scale that had no precedent in any other nation's military history. There were female snipers, female pilots, female tank crew members, female infantry soldiers. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, composed entirely of women who flew obsolete biplanes on night bombing missions against German positions, was so feared that the German soldiers who faced them gave them a nickname that has become famous in military history. They called them the Nachthexen, the Night Witches. The women flew slow, noisy aircraft that they somehow made nearly invisible to German defences by cutting their engines on approach, gliding silently over the German lines before releasing their bombs and restarting their engines to escape. They flew up to 15 missions a night. German soldiers who were bombed by the Night Witches described the experience with a mixture of fury, fear, and a kind of bewildered respect. These were women, their letters noted, doing things that German military culture would never have asked of women. The implications of that fact, what it said about the scale of Soviet commitment, the depth of Soviet desperation and will, were not always comfortable to contemplate. Female snipers were perhaps even more disturbing to the German soldiers who encountered them. The concept of a woman deliberately drawing a bead on a human target and pulling the trigger was something that conflicted with deeply held German ideas about gender, warfare, and civilization. When German soldiers discovered that the sniper who had been picking off their comrades from concealed positions was a woman, the reaction was complex and often violent. Some German soldiers who captured female Soviet soldiers or discovered the bodies of female Soviet snipers wrote about their feelings with an honesty that reveals the depth of the psychological disturbance these women caused. A German sergeant wrote in his diary after his unit found the body of a female sniper that he had expected to feel contempt, and that instead he felt something else entirely. A kind of recognition that this woman had been doing exactly what he had been doing, fighting for her country with the skills she had, and that she had been better at hiding than his comrades and worse at it than she would have needed to be. He wrote that he found himself unable to articulate what he felt. He ended the diary entry with a single word: war. The sniper war on the Eastern Front deserves extended attention, because it was one of the arenas where German soldiers' perception of Soviet capabilities underwent the most dramatic revision. Germany entered the war with a strong sniper tradition of its own, and German snipers on the Eastern Front included some of the most prolific in the history of warfare. But Soviet snipers proved to be something the German military had simply not anticipated encountering at this level. The Soviet Union had developed a sniper program in the 1930s that placed enormous emphasis on accuracy, patience, and concealment, and the combination of the natural environment of the Eastern Front, with its forests, ruins, and rubble, and the extraordinary patience of Soviet marksmen proved devastating to German units. The German army in the West had not faced this kind of systematic sniper threat, and the transition to a war where any movement above the parapet was potentially fatal took considerable adjustment. Soldiers learned to move differently, to think differently about space and visibility, to be afraid in a specific and localized way that was entirely new. The most famous sniper of the war, Vasily Zaitsev, whose legend was later somewhat inflated by Soviet propaganda, but whose actual skill was beyond question, was only the most visible example of a much broader phenomenon. Soviet snipers operated in pairs or small teams. They used terrain with extraordinary skill. They could remain motionless in concealment for hours at a time, and they had an understanding of camouflage that amazed German soldiers who encountered its effects without ever seeing its source. German commanders began issuing specific orders about movement patterns, ordering soldiers not to move at the same time each day, not to use the same paths twice, not to expose themselves in predictable ways. The Soviet sniper had forced a change in behavior at the individual level that went deeper than any other single tactical challenge the Germans faced. And again, what this revealed to the German soldier, slowly and uncomfortably, was not the primitive and disorganized opponent of the propaganda. It was a skilled, patient professional soldier who had been preparing for this war in ways that German intelligence had entirely failed to appreciate. The Battle of Moscow, fought from October to December 1941, represented one of the crucial turning points in the German perception of Soviet soldiers, even though the battle itself was only one element of a much larger and longer transformation. By the time Army Group Center reached the outskirts of Moscow in November 1941, the German army was exhausted in ways that had not been planned for and could not have been fully anticipated. The men had been fighting for 5 months. They were cold. Their supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Their equipment was wearing out faster than it could be replaced, and an increasing number of soldiers were suffering from frostbite and other cold weather injuries. And now, in front of them, was Moscow. And the city refused to fall. The Soviets had mounted a defense of their capital that drew on every human and material resource available. Stalin himself stayed in the city rather than flee, a decision whose symbolic impact was enormous. The workers of Moscow had gone from their factories to the front lines in many cases without stopping. Fresh divisions from Siberia, troops who were properly equipped for winter warfare and who had been training and preparing while the fighting continued in the West, arrived to reinforce the desperate defense. German soldiers who participated in the drive on Moscow in November and December of 1941 wrote about their experiences with a growing sense that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer winning. Not here, not now, not with these frozen, exhausted men against this city that would not give up. A corporal named Johannes Hamm wrote to his parents in December 1941, just days before the great Soviet counteroffensive began, that he was no longer sure about anything. He had believed, they had all believed, that it would be over by autumn. Now it was winter and the Russians were still fighting, and the closer you got to Moscow, the more of them there seemed to be, and they were fighting with a fury that was almost beyond understanding. He wrote that the Russian soldier was not what anyone had told him. He wrote it in a way that suggested he was aware, even as he wrote, that he was saying something dangerous. Then the counteroffensive came. On December 5, 1941, Soviet forces launched a massive counter-offensive along the entire front before Moscow, throwing armies that the German command had not known existed at the exhausted Wehrmacht. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, equipped for winter fighting in ways the Germans were not, struck simultaneously across a front of hundreds of miles. The German lines bent, broke at key points, and recoiled. For the first time since the war began, the German army was in retreat, pulling back across the frozen plains from positions that had seemed almost within reach of total victory. The psychological impact of this reversal on German soldiers cannot be overstated. Everything they had believed about the trajectory of the war, everything the propaganda had told them about the imminent collapse of Soviet resistance, was suddenly in question. The Red Army had not collapsed. The rotten structure had not come crashing down. Instead, it had endured the most devastating military blows any army had ever received, and it had struck back. German soldiers who had faced Soviet counterattacks before Moscow described them in language that is often stripped of ideology and clinical distance. These were men fighting for something, they wrote. These were not compelled automatons. Whatever was driving these soldiers, it was not just the Commissar's pistol. The Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow was the moment when many German soldiers first explicitly formulated, in their letters and diaries, the thought that the war in the East was not going to be the swift campaign they had expected. It was the moment when the word Ivan took on new dimensions of meaning. Ivan was the generic name German soldiers used for their Soviet opponents, just as German soldiers were Tommy to the British and Fritz to the Americans. But on the Eastern Front, Ivan was invested with a specific character that reflected the unique nature of the opponent. Initially used with some dismissiveness, Ivan became over time a name spoken with something more complicated. German soldiers talking about Ivan in the winter of 1941 were talking about an enemy that had survived what no enemy was supposed to survive. They were talking about something that frightened them in a way that the Poles and the French and the British and everyone else they had fought had never quite managed to frighten them. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was catastrophic for the German army in ways that went beyond the purely military. The Wehrmacht had not been equipped or prepared for winter warfare on the Eastern Front. This was not an accident of planning, but a deliberate choice based on the assumption that the war would be over before winter arrived. When it wasn't, when the Russian winter settled over the front with temperatures that plunged to -40 and below, German soldiers faced a crisis of survival that no amount of ideological conviction could address. Men froze to death at their posts. Engines that had functioned flawlessly at normal temperatures refused to start. Lubricants designed for European winters congealed. Weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped themselves in everything they could find, including the civilian clothing they stripped from the occupied. Soviet population and still found themselves inadequate to the cold. Meanwhile, across the front lines, Soviet soldiers in proper winter equipment, with weapons and vehicles designed to function in extreme cold, moved and fought and attacked with a confidence that the German soldiers watching them found profoundly demoralizing. The contrast in winter capability was not simply a matter of equipment, though the equipment gap was real and significant. It was also a matter of cultural and physical adaptation. Soviet soldiers from the areas of Russia that experienced brutal winters had a relationship with extreme cold that was entirely different from anything in the German soldiers' experience. They knew how to move in deep snow, how to build shelters quickly from the materials available, how to maintain their equipment in extreme cold, how to keep their weapons functional when every mechanism threatened to seize up. They knew, in short, how to fight in winter, and winter on the Eastern Front was not 3 months of inconvenient cold. It was a prolonged, brutal, killing season that lasted from October through April, and then returned again year after year for the duration of the war. The German soldiers' experience of this reality, and their observation of how their Soviet opponents handled it, was one of the most significant contributors to the evolving German view. A soldier who could not handle the cold, who was shaking too hard to aim, and whose fingers were too numb to reload, watching his opponent move with sure-footed confidence through the same killing cold, had to revise his picture of what kind of man he was fighting. The partisan war, which raged throughout the occupied Soviet territories from the very beginning of the German occupation, added another dimension to the German soldiers' experience of the Soviet enemy. Soviet partisans, irregular forces operating behind German lines, conducted sabotage operations against German supply lines, ambushed German units, gathered intelligence, maintained contact with the Soviet state, and in many cases fought with extraordinary effectiveness against a military occupier that outnumbered and outgunned them at every level. The German response to the partisan threat was ferocious and, by any moral standard, deeply criminal. Reprisal operations that killed civilians by the hundreds for every German soldier killed by partisans were routine. The occupied Soviet territories became the site of some of the most appalling atrocities of the entire war, conducted by German forces against a civilian population that was understood, under the ideological framework of the Nazi regime, to be a pool of potential and actual enemies. But the partisan war also forced German soldiers into an encounter with the Soviet character that was, in its own terrible way, revealing. What struck German soldiers about the partisans was not their military effectiveness alone, though this was considerable and grew dramatically as the war went on. It was the breadth of who chose to become a partisan. Old men and teenagers, farmers and factory workers, priests and teachers, women and men of every description took up arms against the German occupation. The partisan movement was not imposed from above in any simple sense. Yes, the Soviet state supported and organized it, and eventually played a significant coordinating role. But the volunteers who formed the backbone of the partisan movement were driven by something more personal and more immediate than state direction. They had watched their villages burned, their families killed, their neighbors shot. They were fighting for something real and concrete. And the German soldiers who encountered them, who had to deal with the ambushes and the sabotage and the constant background threat of violence, understood this even when they were killing them. An officer who participated in anti-partisan operations in Belarus wrote in his diary that there was no shortage of people willing to die for Russia. He wrote it as a military assessment, not a moral observation, but the moral dimensions were there, pressing against the factual surface of his words. The question of what German soldiers thought of Soviet tactics and military competence is one where the evolution over the course of the war is perhaps most clearly visible. In 1941, German soldiers' assessments of Soviet tactics were largely contemptuous, and in many respects their contempt was not unfounded. Soviet tactical decision-making in 1941 was frequently poor, sometimes disastrous. Frontal assaults against prepared positions with inadequate preparation and fire support were common. Coordination between infantry, armour and artillery was often non-existent. Units that should have supported each other fought in isolation. The rigid command system prevented the kind of flexible, initiative-based response that might have exploited opportunities when they arose. German soldiers who observed these attacks could see the failures clearly, and they noted them. The Soviet soldier might be brave, even extraordinarily brave, but he was brave in the service of tactics that were throwing away lives to no purpose. This was the military dimension of the German contempt for Soviet leadership. And in 1941, it was a fair observation. But what German soldiers also began to notice, and what became more and more apparent as the war went on, was that the Soviet system was learning. It was learning from its mistakes in a way that was systematic and organized, if brutally costly. The Soviet military command analyzed each failure, extracted lessons from the catastrophic defeats of 1941, and applied those lessons with increasing effectiveness. The artillery coordination that had been absent in 1941 was present in 1942. The combined arms cooperation that had been a hopeless ideal in 1941 was a functioning reality in 1943. The tactical flexibility that the Soviet command system had systematically suppressed in the early months of the war was gradually, painfully, being reintroduced as it became clear that the alternative was annihilation. German soldiers who had been contemptuous of Soviet tactical skills in 1941 were facing a qualitatively different opponent by 1942 and 1943, and the gap continued to close throughout the remainder of the war. The most immediate and visceral expression of Soviet military capability, as far as the ordinary German soldier was concerned, was not strategy or operational planning, but the experiences of direct combat. And direct combat on the Eastern Front had a quality that distinguished it sharply from anything the German army had encountered in the West. Soviet soldiers attacked differently. They defended differently. They died differently. And what German soldiers made of all of this, in the heat of combat and in the reflective moments that followed, tells us more about the true nature of German perceptions than any amount of official pronouncement or ideological declaration. The German infantry soldiers' direct combat experience with Soviet soldiers produced a catalogue of observations and impressions that runs through the letters, diaries, and post-war memoirs like a recurring set of themes. One of the most frequently noted was the Soviet capacity to attack. When Soviet infantry went forward in an attack, the German soldiers facing them described an experience that was unlike anything in their previous military experience. The attacks were often preceded by massive artillery bombardments that left the German positions shattered and the defenders dazed and disoriented. Then the infantry would come, sometimes in waves, sometimes in loose groups that used terrain skillfully, sometimes in the dense masses that German propaganda depicted as primitive human wave attacks, though the tactical reality was usually more complex than that phrase implies, and they kept coming. That was what German soldiers wrote about most, frequently. Not that the first wave was fearsome, though it was, but that when the first wave fell, the second wave came, and when the second wave fell, the third wave came. The attacks had a quality of relentlessness that German soldiers found psychologically exhausting in a way that was qualitatively different from the physical exhaustion of combat. You could kill them, and they would keep coming. What do you do against men like that? The human cost of these attacks was something that German soldiers were aware of and that, in some cases, troubled them in unexpected ways. A German machine gunner who had been stationed on the Eastern Front for over a year wrote in his diary after repelling a major Soviet attack that his gun barrel had become too hot to touch from the volume of fire he had put through it. He wrote it as a professional observation about the maintenance of his weapon, but then he wrote something else. He wrote that he had been counting as best he could, and that he thought his position had killed more men in that afternoon than any human being should ever be responsible for killing in an entire lifetime. He wrote that the men who had come at him had not been cowards. He used that word specifically, not cowards. He wrote that they had come into his fire with a steadiness that he found, and he stopped his sentence and started again, that he found it hard to describe in a way that didn't sound like admiration. He found the note to himself that this was not the kind of thing you were supposed to write in a diary on the Eastern Front, and then he wrote it anyway. The nature of Soviet mass attacks, what the Germans called the Massenangriff or mass attack, was something that German military analysts spent considerable effort trying to understand. The conventional German view, reflecting the ideological framework, was that these attacks represented a Soviet disregard for human life, a primitive willingness to squander men that only made sense within a system where individual life had no value. This interpretation was not entirely wrong in its factual dimension. Soviet commanders in 1941 and 1942 did indeed squander lives on a scale that would have been unacceptable in any Western army, and the human cost of the mass attacks was devastating. But German analysts who looked more closely at what was actually happening found something more complex than simple nihilism. The Soviet mass attacks at their best were not simply throwing bodies at machine guns. They were a way of overwhelming German defensive capacity through sheer weight of numbers, accepting very high casualties in order to saturate German firepower and break through before reinforcement could arrive. It was a brutal calculus, but it was a calculus, not chaos. And as Soviet tactical sophistication improved, the mass attacks gave way increasingly to combined arms operations that were far more efficient and far more deadly to the defenders. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943, represents the defining moment in the German soldiers' experience of the Soviet enemy, and in some ways in the entire history of the war on the Eastern Front. No other engagement so completely concentrated and crystallized the qualities that defined the Soviet soldier as Stalingrad did. The city itself, sprawling along the west bank of the Volga for over 50 kilometers, became the scene of a battle so intense, so prolonged, and so unlike anything that had been planned or anticipated that it required both armies to develop new forms of warfare almost in real time. The Germans, who had broken through Soviet lines and reached the Volga north and south of the city, expected Stalingrad to fall quickly. It didn't. What followed was one of the most savage urban battles in military history. The German army, built around mobility and combined arms maneuver, was forced to fight in a terrain where mobility was impossible and where the advantages of tanks and aircraft were largely negated by the rubble and the closeness of the fighting. The Soviets, defending a city that Stalin had personally named after himself and that had become a symbol of Soviet resistance that transcended any purely military calculation, fought for every building, every floor of every building, every room on every floor. German soldiers who had moved freely across the steppes in their armoured vehicles found themselves in combat at ranges of 10, 5, sometimes 2 metres, fighting with grenades and entrenching tools and bayonets in the ruins of factories and apartment blocks for ground that could be measured in the thickness of a wall. The entire German conception of warfare was inverted in Stalingrad's rubble. And the Soviet soldier in this environment proved himself the Germans' equal or superior in ways that no amount of ideological conditioning could explain away. The term Rattenkrieg, rat war, which German soldiers coined to describe the fighting in Stalingrad, captures something important about the nature of the experience. The fighting had descended below the level of tactics and strategy into something almost biological. A struggle of small groups in confined spaces where the only relevant skills were animal cunning, physical courage, and the willingness to close with the enemy at the closest possible range. And in this environment, Soviet soldiers excelled. Vasily Chuikov, who commanded the Soviet 62nd Army that held Stalingrad, developed the tactic of hugging the German lines, keeping his forces so close to the enemy that German artillery and air support could not be used without killing their own troops. German soldiers called this being grabbed by the collar. It was enormously effective and deeply demoralizing. Every advantage that the Germans' superior firepower and air support gave them was neutralized by the technique of maintaining constant close contact. And it required enormous courage from the Soviet soldiers who implemented it because it meant advancing toward the enemy even under fire, closing the range rather than seeking cover, ensuring that survival lay in killing the enemy rather than hiding from him. The snipers of Stalingrad achieved a kind of legendary status on both sides that illustrates the peculiar and intimate nature of the struggle in the city. In a battle fought largely underground and in ruins, the sniper was a figure of enormous psychological importance. The best Soviet snipers in Stalingrad, men like Vasily Zaitsev, who is credited with killing over 220 German soldiers at Stalingrad alone, became symbols of a resistance that refused to be measured in simple military terms. The German High Command, apparently convinced that eliminating Zaitsev would have a significant effect on Soviet morale, sent one of their best snipers, Major Erwin König, the head of the German Army sniper school at Zossen, to hunt him down. The resulting duel between the two men, which Zaitsev describes in his memoirs and which has become one of the iconic stories of the battle, ended with Zaitsev killing König. Whether every detail of the story is precisely as recorded is debated by historians, but the broad outline is well documented, and what matters for our purposes is what the story reveals about the German perception of their opponents. The German High Command took the threat from a single Soviet sniper seriously enough to send their best man to deal with it. That is a form of respect, however grudging and tactical, that speaks volumes. The German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad as the Soviet Operation Uranus encirclement closed around them in November 1942 were experiencing the most brutal possible education in the quality of the Soviet enemy. The encirclement, which was a masterpiece of operational planning executed by Soviet commanders who had absorbed the lessons of the Germans' own successes in 1941, trapped the German Sixth Army and elements of several other formations, over 300,000 men, in a shrinking pocket with no way out. The men inside the pocket watched as the Soviet forces closed in, methodically, relentlessly, with an organizational competence that the Germans, who had marveled at their own operational skills in 1941, could recognize and were forced to acknowledge. This was not the chaotic, blundering Soviet army of the ideological caricature. This was a sophisticated military force executing a complex operation across hundreds of miles of front simultaneously, coordinating multiple army groups in a way that required exactly the kind of operational genius that Nazi ideology had insisted was beyond the Slavic race. The letters that came out of the Stalingrad pocket, many of them the last letters these men would ever write, carry an emotional weight that is almost unbearable to read. Some of them contain direct assessments of the Soviet soldier that strip away every layer of ideology and propaganda and speak in the plainest possible terms. A sergeant named Kurt Ruber, who was also an artist and whose Stalingrad Madonna drawing made inside the pocket became one of the most famous images of the war, wrote to his wife about the Soviet soldiers they were fighting in terms that could not be characterized as contempt. in any form. He wrote about their courage. He wrote about their skill. He wrote about the way they kept fighting no matter what was thrown at them. He wrote that he had come to understand something about the Soviet character, something that he couldn't articulate perfectly, but that he felt with certainty, which was that these people were fighting for something real and that this made them more dangerous and more worthy of respect than anything he had been told to expect. He died in captivity in 1944. His letters survived. The experience of Soviet prisoners who passed through German lines and the German soldiers who processed and interacted with them provides another window into the evolving perception. In the early months of the war, German soldiers had generally treated Soviet prisoners with a combination of contempt and, in many cases, criminal brutality that reflected the ideological framework within which the war was being fought. The starvation and murder of Soviet prisoners in German custody in 1941 and 1942, in which over 3 million men died, was one of the great atrocities of the war, and it was carried out not just by SS units but by regular Wehrmacht soldiers acting within a system that classified Soviet prisoners as subhuman, and therefore outside the protections of the Geneva Convention. But even within this context of systematic dehumanization, German soldiers' individual encounters with Soviet prisoners often produced responses that complicated the ideological picture. German soldiers noted in letters and diaries the physical quality of Soviet soldiers even in captivity. These were not, they observed, stunted or inferior. Physical specimens. They were often large, physically powerful men whose bodies showed the marks of hard outdoor labor. They were quiet in captivity, watching, assessing, maintaining a dignity that German soldiers found disquieting in men who were supposed to be grateful to be alive. Some prisoners spoke German, having learned it in schools before the war, and this too was disorienting. The Nazi framework required the Slavic Untermenschen to be primitive and ignorant. The Soviet soldier who could discuss German literature or ask coherent questions about the progress of the war did not fit this picture. A German officer described an encounter with a Soviet prisoner, a young officer who had been educated at a Soviet technical university, in which the prisoner's intelligence and dignity were so apparent that the German found himself uncertain how to proceed. He wrote about it with a kind of bewilderment that, had he pursued its implications, would have unravelled the entire ideological framework on which the German war was built. The evolution of German respect for Soviet military competence is nowhere more clearly visible than in the German reaction to Soviet artillery. Throughout the war, but with increasing intensity from 1942 onward, Soviet artillery played a devastating and dominant role in the fighting on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had an artillery doctrine that emphasized mass, concentration, and continuous support, and as the war went on and Soviet production ramped up to replace the catastrophic losses of 1941, the quantities of artillery that the Soviets could bring to bear grew to numbers that seem almost incomprehensible. By the time of the great Soviet offensives of 1944, artillery densities of 200 or 300 guns per kilometre of front were not uncommon. German soldiers who survived these barrages described the experience in terms that make clear why they became associated, in the German soldiers' vocabulary, with something beyond ordinary military experience. The ground shook continuously. Individual explosions became indistinguishable. Men were buried alive in their foxholes by the pressure waves alone, without ever being touched by a fragment. Concrete bunkers collapsed. Steel collapsed. The landscape itself was transformed into something unrecognizable. The Katyusha rocket launcher, which had been a shocking surprise in 1941, became by 1943 and 1944 a ubiquitous feature of Soviet offensives that German soldiers dreaded, with a consistency that appears in virtually every account of the later war. The salvo of rockets, the shrieking sound of their approach, the impossibility of knowing where they would land, the way they seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, produced a psychological reaction in German soldiers that veteran combatants described as unlike anything else in their experience. An experienced German sergeant who had served since 1939 wrote in 1944 that he could endure ordinary artillery with the stoicism of a professional soldier. But the Katyusha, he wrote, did something to a man's nerve that had nothing to do with the danger it represented. It was the sound. It was the helplessness. You could hear it coming, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, you could do. He wrote that Soviet gunners had understood something about human psychology that the Germans had never fully grasped, which was that there are forms of fear more powerful than the fear of death, and that the Katyusha produced them reliably. The T-34 tank remained throughout the war the most visible symbol of the Soviet Union's industrial and technological achievement, and of the German military's failure to properly assess the enemy they were facing. By 1943, improved German tank designs, including the Tiger and the Panther, had addressed some of the technological gap that the T-34's original appearance had revealed, but the numbers never favoured Germany. Soviet factories, many of them relocated to the Urals and Siberia to escape the German advance, were producing tanks in quantities that the German war economy could not match. German tank crews who faced Soviet armour in the great tank battles of 1943 at Kursk and in the fighting that followed were often outnumbered by factors that made individual tactical skill and technological quality increasingly irrelevant in the face of simple arithmetic. A German tank commander from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, writing about the fighting at Prokhorovka during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, described watching Soviet tanks charge into point-blank range even when it was tactically suicidal, accepting certain destruction in order to get close enough to destroy their opponents. The exchange rate was terrible for the Soviets, but there were always more Soviet tanks. He wrote it as a military assessment. He wrote it without triumph. The Battle of Kursk, fought in July and August 1943, was the largest tank battle in history and the operation that definitively ended German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht was fighting a defensive war against a Soviet military that had achieved strategic superiority. And the German soldiers who fought at Kursk and in the months that followed were fighting a Soviet army that was, in every measurable dimension, a different force from the one they had encountered in June 1941. The Red Army of 1943 had absorbed the lessons of 2 years of catastrophic defeat and had transformed itself at enormous cost into a competent, flexible, and increasingly powerful military organization. Its commanders had learned. Its soldiers had hardened, its logistics had improved, its equipment had in many categories surpassed what Germany could field. The gap that the German army had crossed the Soviet border expecting to exploit had not only closed, but in many areas reversed. For the German soldier in the field, this transformation was experienced not as an abstract, strategic shift, but as a daily and intensifying reality of combat. The Soviet attacks that had been costly and often poorly coordinated in 1941 were now precise and devastating. The infantry that had attacked in mass and without support were now attacking behind rolling barrages with coordinated armour, systematically destroying German defensive positions one by one. The command on the Soviet side that had been rigid and fearful in 1941 was showing increasing flexibility and initiative at every level, from army group down to squad. The German soldier who thought he understood the Soviet enemy based on the experiences of 1941 and 1942 was facing a fundamentally different opponent by 1943 and 1944, and the adjustment required was profound. How did ordinary German soldiers account for this transformation? The letters and diaries of the later war years show a variety of responses, and the ideological dimension does not disappear entirely even in 1944. Some German soldiers continued to attribute Soviet improvement to the material assistance of the Western Allies, particularly the trucks, jeeps, and food provided under the American Lend-Lease program, in ways that allowed them to maintain some version of the idea that the Soviet soldier himself was unchanged, and that it was only external assistance that had enabled the Soviet improvement. This interpretation was not entirely without foundation. The Lend-Lease contribution to Soviet logistical capability was significant and real, but it was increasingly inadequate as an explanation for what German soldiers were experiencing, because the transformation they were witnessing was not only in logistics and equipment, it was in the quality of decision-making, the flexibility of command, the tactical skill of individual soldiers, the professional competence of NCOs and junior officers, all of which had improved dramatically and in ways that could not be explained by American trucks. Other German soldiers, increasingly as the war went on, simply acknowledged the reality of what they were facing without feeling the need to explain it within any ideological framework. These were men who had been fighting too long and seen too much to maintain comfortable abstractions. A corporal in the 296th Infantry Division, writing in the autumn of 1943 after the retreat from Kursk, noted in his diary that the Ivans were good. He used the word simply, without qualification or apology. He meant it as a professional assessment, one soldier recognizing the quality of another. He went on to note specific aspects of Soviet tactical skill that had impressed him. The way their scouts operated, the way they exploited ground, the way their NCOs maintained cohesion under fire. He wrote it all down with the meticulous attention to detail of a man who knew that the quality of his opponent was a matter of survival. He was right, and his willingness to see his opponent clearly, to abandon the ideological picture in favour of the tactical reality, was one of the things that, by this point in the war, distinguished the German soldiers who were still alive from the ones who were not. The concept of the Untermenschen, the subhuman, had been so central to the German conduct of the war in the East that its collapse under the weight of experience had implications far beyond the purely military. If the Soviet soldier was not what the ideology had said, then what else was not as described? If the Red Army could produce soldiers who outfought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted the finest military force in the world, then the entire racial framework on which the Nazi war effort was built was a lie. German soldiers were not generally given to this kind of systematic political thinking, and the vast majority did not draw the explicit conclusion. But the unease, the cognitive dissonance between what they had been told and what they were experiencing runs through the later war letters and diaries as a constant undercurrent. Men were fighting for an ideology that their own experience was refuting, and the psychological pressure this created was enormous and largely unacknowledged. The German army's treatment of Soviet soldiers and the Soviet civilian population during the occupation was one of the great crimes of the war, and its relationship to the German soldiers' perception of their opponents is complex and uncomfortable to trace. The systematic murder of Jews, Soviet prisoners, partisans, and civilians that occurred throughout the occupied Soviet territories was carried out by a combination of ideologically motivated forces and ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers who had been conditioned by years of dehumanizing propaganda to participate in or passively accept atrocities. The same German soldier who might write in his diary about the impressive courage of Soviet defenders might also participate in, or observe without protest, the shooting of Soviet prisoners taken the following day. These two realities coexisted in the minds of many German soldiers, and the psychological mechanisms by which this coexistence was maintained tell us something important about the difference between tactical respect and genuine human recognition. Some German soldiers did make the connection explicitly. There are letters and diary entries, not many, but a significant and telling minority in which German soldiers wrote about the contradiction between the enemy they were fighting and the ideological category they had been assigned to occupy. A lieutenant in the Fourth Army, writing to his brother in September 1942, made this connection with unusual directness. He wrote that the Russians were the best soldiers he had ever fought, better in many respects than anything he had encountered in the West, and that this fact made the entire ideological framework of the war impossible for him to maintain. He wrote that you could not fight alongside men, even against men, for this long and maintain the belief that they were less than human. He wrote it knowing it was dangerous to write it. He mailed it anyway. His brother saved the letter. It survived the war. The question of what German soldiers feared most about their Soviet opponents produces a revealing set of answers when traced through the documentary record. The fear of the Katyusha has already been mentioned. There was also a deep fear of Soviet artillery in general, which by the middle years of the war had achieved a dominance on the Eastern Front that had no equivalent in any other theatre of the war. There was the fear of winter, and of the Soviet soldiers' ability to use it against them. There was the specific fear of Soviet snipers, which produced behavioural changes at the individual level that are well documented. But there was also, increasingly from 1942 onward, a fear that was less tactical and more existential. It was the fear of what Soviet soldiers would do to Germans if they caught them, and this fear was not irrational. It was grounded in a clear-eyed understanding of what Germany had done in the Soviet Union and what German soldiers might reasonably expect in return. The German army's conduct in the occupied Soviet territories, including the mass murder of prisoners, the deliberate starvation of the civilian population, the destruction of entire villages in anti-partisan reprisals, and the broader project of racial subjugation that the Nazi leadership had planned from the beginning, had created a cycle of violence and atrocity that every German soldier on the Eastern Front was aware of to some degree. The Soviet soldiers who had come from the areas under German occupation, who had lost family members to German violence, who had seen what the occupation meant for the people they had grown up among, carried with them a motivation for revenge that was specific and personal and intense. German soldiers could see this. They could feel it in the way Soviet attacks pressed forward with a fury that seemed to exceed any purely military calculation. They could feel it in what happened to German soldiers who were captured in the later stages of the war, when Soviet troops reached German soil and encountered for the first time the relative comfort of a country that had not been occupied and destroyed. The fear of what would happen when the reckoning came was one of the strongest psychological forces operating on German soldiers in the final years of the war. The night warfare that Soviet soldiers conducted with particular effectiveness was another source of German unease and grudging respect. Soviet doctrine placed considerable emphasis on night operations, recognizing that darkness neutralized many of the German advantages in firepower and air support, while allowing Soviet infantry to close with their opponents at ranges where individual fighting skills mattered more than technology. German soldiers who served on the Eastern Front developed a specific dread of Soviet night attacks that runs through the documentary record as one of the consistent features of the experience. The attacks came without warning, exploiting the psychological vulnerability of soldiers in darkness, and they were conducted with a skill at movement and noise discipline that German soldiers found startling from an army they had expected to be tactically crude. A corporal in the 12th Infantry Division wrote in his diary in the winter of 1942 that the nights on the Eastern Front were unlike anything he had experienced in the war before. You could post sentries, you could set up tripwires and flares, you could arrange your defensive positions to cover every approach, and the Russians would still find a way through. They seemed to move through the darkness like something that belonged to it. He wrote that his men had stopped using the word ambush and had started using a word he invented himself, a compound that translated roughly as shadow killing, because that was what it felt like. Men who had been alive at dusk were simply not alive at dawn, and there was no sound in between that you could point to as the moment it happened. The Soviet night infiltration tactics were indeed a developed military skill that had been refined through experience on the Finnish border and in the early months of the war with Germany. Soviet scouts and small infantry units were trained specifically in the techniques of silent movement, concealment, and nocturnal navigation that made them effective in the darkness. They used terrain features to mask their approach. They moved in groups small enough to avoid detection, but large enough to overwhelm a sentry post, and they had developed hand signals and other non-verbal communication methods that allowed them to coordinate actions without sound. German soldiers who discovered the techniques being used against them could appreciate the skill even as they feared the results. An officer in the 9th Army who studied captured Soviet training documents on night infiltration wrote a memo to his divisional headquarters in 1942, noting that the methods described in the documents were sophisticated and well considered, reflecting extensive practical experience, and that German training in night operations would benefit from studying and adapting similar approaches. The implication of the memo, that the supposedly primitive Soviet enemy had developed infantry skills that the Wehrmacht could learn from, was understood by everyone who read it, though no one said it explicitly. The Soviet use of cavalry in the war was another element that consistently surprised German soldiers, and their surprise tells us something interesting about the assumptions they brought to the conflict. The German military, with its emphasis on mechanization and armor, had largely moved beyond the concept of horse cavalry as a serious fighting force by the time the war began. German planners expected that any modern army worthy of the name would have done the same. But the Soviet army retained large cavalry formations throughout the war, and they proved far more effective than the German analysts had anticipated. Soviet cavalry was not the charge-across open-ground cavalry of 19th century warfare. It was a mobile infantry force that used horses for rapid movement across terrain that was impassable to vehicles, particularly in winter and spring, and then dismounted to fight. Soviet cavalry formations could cover distances in deep snow that mechanized units could not even attempt, and they could appear in areas that German planners had classified as inaccessible, creating disruption and uncertainty that had effects well beyond their actual numbers. German soldiers' encounter with Soviet cavalry produced reactions ranging from bemused contempt to genuine alarm. An officer in Army Group South wrote in 1942 that encountering cavalry in what was supposed to be a modern mechanized war was initially almost comic, as if history had played a trick on them. Then the cavalry cut his unit's supply line, held it for 3 days, and disappeared before adequate forces could be assembled to deal with them, and the comedy disappeared completely. He wrote that the Soviet cavalryman was as formidable as any soldier he had encountered, and that the horse was not a sign of backwardness, but a tool precisely adapted to the specific conditions of this specific war. He wrote that he had revised his opinion of cavalry very thoroughly and very quickly, and that the revision had been expensive. The Soviet military engineers and the river-crossing operations they conducted throughout the war generated considerable German professional respect that is well documented in after-action reports and personal accounts. The Soviet Union's geography is dominated by major rivers running roughly north to south, and any major military operation in either direction required the crossing of these obstacles. Soviet combat engineers developed techniques for rapid river crossing under fire that were, in the assessment of German engineers who observed and studied them, among the most skilled and effective ever developed. The ability to throw pontoon bridges across major rivers in hours under artillery fire in darkness while simultaneous direct fire suppressed the defenders was an engineering achievement that German military professionals acknowledged with frankness. A German engineer officer who was captured Soviet technical manuals on river crossing in 1943 sent a report to his headquarters stating that the methods described were in several respects superior to German equivalents, and that adoption of some of the techniques would benefit German engineering operations. The report was noted, filed, and had no practical effect because by 1943 Germany was doing very little offensive river crossing. But its existence tells us something about the honest professional assessment of Soviet capability that German military experts were arriving at, even as the political and propaganda machinery maintained its fiction of German superiority. The Soviet penal battalions, known as Strafbats, which were used throughout the war to deploy soldiers convicted of military offences or political crimes in dangerous roles that offered the possibility of redemption through combat, were another institution that generated a specific German response. The Strafbats were used for mine-clearing operations, for the first wave of attacks on heavily defended positions, for situations where the tactical situation was desperate enough to require accepting extreme casualties. German soldiers who encountered Strafbat units in battle noticed something specific about them. They attacked with a ferocity that exceeded even the standard of Soviet infantry assault, which was itself formidable. They appeared to have nothing to lose, and the accuracy of that perception informed the intensity with which they fought. A German lieutenant in the 38th Infantry Division wrote about encountering what his intelligence section identified as a penal unit during the fighting in the Ukraine in 1943, noting that the attack was unlike anything he had seen before in the war. The men came through a barrage that had already reduced a normal assault to scattered remnants, and they kept coming. They went for close combat immediately rather than using the fire and movement tactics that Soviet infantry had become increasingly skilled at. They were, he wrote, men who had decided that this particular fight was their last regardless of how it ended, and who were simply choosing the manner of their ending. He found it the most terrifying thing he had experienced in the war to that point, and he had been on the Eastern Front for 2 years. The role of Soviet women in roles beyond combat was also something that German soldiers found consistently remarkable and unsettling. Soviet women served as doctors, nurses, signal operators, logistics personnel, and in countless other roles that brought them close to or directly into the combat zone. German military culture, shaped by a society in which women's roles were rigidly defined and excluded from anything touching on military activity, had not prepared German soldiers for an army in which women were simply present as functional members of the military organization. German soldiers who encountered female Soviet medical personnel, who ran forward under fire to reach wounded soldiers and drag them to safety, wrote about the experience with varying mixtures of admiration, bewilderment, and the specific discomfort of encountering a reality that did not fit their conceptual framework. A German sergeant whose unit captured a Soviet field hospital in 1942 wrote in his diary that the women who ran the hospital had not fled when the German troops arrived, had not hidden, had not attempted to use their sex as any kind of protection. They had been performing surgery when the Germans burst in, and they had continued to perform surgery while the Germans stood there uncertain what to do. He wrote that the surgeon, a woman of perhaps 35, had looked up at the German soldiers in her operating room and asked whether they intended to shoot her patient. When told they did not, she had returned to her work. He wrote that he had never in his life felt more uncertain about what civilization meant. The Soviet Air Force, which German air doctrine and propaganda had written off at the beginning of the war, provides one of the most striking examples of the broader pattern of German underestimation and eventual enforced reassessment. In the first days of the war, the Luftwaffe had destroyed Soviet air power on an extraordinary scale, wiping out thousands of aircraft and establishing a dominance of the air that seemed to confirm every German assumption about Soviet technological backwardness. But the Soviet aviation industry, relocated east of the Urals beyond German reach, rebuilt with extraordinary speed, and Soviet pilots who had initially been poorly trained and tactically naive, underwent a crash program of development that produced, by 1943, aviators who were genuinely dangerous to experienced German pilots. Soviet fighter tactics evolved rapidly, drawing on both the direct experience of combat and the influence of Allied techniques shared through the military-mission relationships established with Britain and the United States. German Luftwaffe pilots who had initially spoken about Soviet aircraft with contempt began writing and speaking about them with increasing respect as the war went on. An ace pilot with the JG-51 fighter wing, who had scored early victories over Soviet aircraft without any particular sense of danger, wrote to a colleague in 1943 that the situation had changed considerably. The aircraft were better, he noted, but more importantly, the men flying them were better. They used their aircraft strengths intelligently, they adapted their tactics to the circumstances, and they did not make the same mistakes twice. He called them serious opponents, and he meant it as the highest compliment in his vocabulary. The Soviet logistical achievement during the war is something that German soldiers observed primarily through its effects rather than its mechanisms, but those effects were increasingly hard to ignore from 1943 onward. The ability of the Red Army to sustain major offensive operations across hundreds of miles of front in conditions of extreme weather and over terrain that ranged from impossible to merely very difficult required a logistical organization of formidable complexity. German soldiers who saw the ammunition, fuel, food and replacement equipment flowing forward to support the great Soviet offensives of 1943, 1944 and 1945 were seeing the results of an organizational achievement that the pre-war German assessment of Soviet capability had declared impossible. The American Lend-Lease contribution, particularly in trucks, was real and significant. But the human organization, the planning, the execution of logistics on this scale, was a Soviet achievement, and German supply officers who studied it professionally acknowledged as much. A German logistics officer who spent time after the war analyzing Soviet supply records noted that the organization and execution of Soviet operational logistics from 1943 onward was superior to anything Germany had managed, and that this superiority was one of the decisive factors in the outcome of the war. The German experience of the Soviet counteroffensives of 1943 and 1944, which systematically drove the Wehrmacht from the territory it had conquered in 1941 and 1942, was experienced by German soldiers as a continuous and deepening revelation of Soviet military capability. Each major operation revealed new aspects of Soviet planning and execution that German military professionals were forced to acknowledge. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944 simultaneously with the Allied landings in Normandy, was the operation that finally convinced even the most skeptical German military observers that the Soviet army had become the most capable land-fighting force in the world. The operation destroyed Army Group Center, the largest formation in the German order of battle on the Eastern Front, in a matter of weeks. It was an operational catastrophe of a scale that dwarfed even Stalingrad. German divisions were encircled, destroyed, and their remnants driven west in a disorder that mirrored the Soviet defeats of 1941 with a terrible symmetry. German soldiers who survived Bagration and the collapse that followed described it in letters and diaries with a dazed quality that reflects the magnitude of what they had experienced. They had spent years observing Soviet soldiers learning to fight the way the Germans fought. Now the lesson was complete, and the German army was on the receiving end of everything that had been so destructive, and so effective when the Germans had been doing it 3 years before. The final battles of the war, the fighting in Poland and East Prussia and ultimately in Germany itself as Soviet forces crossed the German border for the first time, produced the extreme terminus of the German soldier's experience of his Soviet opponent. These battles were conducted in the context of a total collapse of German strategic position, with men fighting in isolation and in hopeless circumstances, often without coherent orders, often simply trying to survive long enough to reach a position where they could surrender to Western Allied forces rather than to the Soviets. The fear of capture by the Red Army that had been growing throughout the latter years of the war reached its most acute form in these final weeks, and it was a fear that was not irrational. Soviet soldiers entering Germany carried with them the accumulated weight of everything Germany had done to the Soviet Union, and the violence that erupted in the final phase of the war against the German civilian population was real and terrible. But even in this extreme context, German soldiers continued to observe and note the qualities of their opponents with a specificity that reflects the deep impression that 4 years of fighting had made. A German infantryman defending Berlin in April 1945, writing a final letter to his family that he sent with a comrade who was being evacuated for wounds, described the Soviet soldiers pressing against the city's defences with the directness of a man who had given up illusion. He wrote that they were extraordinary soldiers. He wrote it plainly, without qualification, without ideological hedging. He wrote that they attacked continuously, that they showed a skill and a determination that was completely unlike the propaganda they had been raised on, and that he understood, finally, why Germany had lost. He wrote that the Soviet soldier had defeated them not because Germany was racially inferior or militarily incompetent, but because the Soviet soldier was simply more committed to what he was fighting for. He wrote that you cannot beat men who are willing to do what these men were willing to do. The letter was found after the war in the effects of the wounded comrade who carried it. It was never delivered. His family never knew what he had understood in those final days. The experience of German soldiers who served in the Eastern Front and survived to old age produced a body of testimony and memoir that continues to be studied and analysed by historians, seeking to understand what the war was truly like at the individual human level. The picture that emerges from this testimony is one that resists simple characterization. German veterans of the Eastern Front were not uniformly repentant about their own role in the conflict, nor were they uniformly defiant. They were men who had lived through something that permanently marked them, who carried memories that would not go away, and who often found it difficult to explain to people who had not been there what the experience had actually been. But when they talked about the Soviet soldiers they had fought, the veteran German accounts show a remarkable consistency. The contempt was gone. The ideology was gone. What remained was the memory of specific encounters, specific moments, specific men on the other side of the wire who had done things that the German veterans still found remarkable decades later. The Soviet soldier's courage, his endurance, his skill in the dark, in the cold, in the ruins of buildings, the way he kept coming, no matter what you did, to stop him. The way he fought for something so clearly real to him that it transformed ordinary endurance into something that German soldiers, looking back across the decades, could only call extraordinary. The broader implications of the German soldiers' evolving perception of the Soviet fighting man extend beyond the specific historical context of the Second World War. What the German experience on the Eastern Front demonstrates with painful clarity is the cost of ideological blindness. The German military entered the war against the Soviet Union with a set of assumptions about the human quality of their opponents that was not only wrong but catastrophically wrong, and the price of that wrongness was paid in blood on a scale that still defies full comprehension. The lesson is not a comfortable one because it implicates not just the specific ideology of Nazi Germany, but the broader human tendency to construct hierarchies of capability and worth that make it easier to dismiss the reality of those we are in conflict with. The German soldier who crossed the Soviet border in 1941 was not uniquely wicked. He was a product of a society that had convinced itself, through years of sustained ideological effort, that a specific group of human beings was less capable, less human, less worthy of serious consideration than his own, and the war taught him, at an unimaginable price, that every single element of this belief was false. Perhaps the most honest summary of what German soldiers truly thought of Soviet soldiers comes not from any single document or testimony, but from the accumulated weight of the entire record, read in sequence, traced through the arc of the war from beginning to end. At the start, contempt. In the first weeks, surprise. In the autumn of 1941, unease. After Moscow, a kind of reckoning. After Stalingrad, something that no ideology could contain. The recognition that what stood across from them was a human capability equal to anything they possessed. By the middle years of the war, the German soldier who was still honest with himself had arrived at a simple and irreducible truth. The Soviet soldier was, on any measure that actually mattered in combat, the finest soldier he had ever fought. He was tougher, more patient, more motivated, and increasingly more skilled. He fought for real things, and he could not be stopped from fighting for them by any amount of killing. He was the most dangerous opponent Germany had ever faced, and he was going to win. Not today, perhaps, not in this particular battle, but he was going to win. The German soldiers who understood this understood it with a clarity that no propaganda could reach. And the ones who refused to understand it died with their illusions intact, which was perhaps, in the circumstances, its own kind of mercy. The question of how we remember this perception today, and what it means for our understanding of the war and the people who fought it, is one that historians and thoughtful readers continue to wrestle with. The Soviet soldier's quality and courage and sacrifice is not always given the recognition it deserves in Western accounts of the Second World War, which tend to focus on the Western theatres of the conflict and to treat the Eastern Front as a somewhat distant and incomprehensible thing that happened far away. The statistics, of course, tell a different story. The Soviet Union suffered more military deaths in the Battle of Stalingrad alone than the United States suffered in the entire war. The Eastern Front consumed more human life than all the other theatres of the war combined. And the Soviet soldiers who fought and died in that conflict were doing so in defence of something real, against an enemy whose intentions toward them had been made explicit and whose conduct in the occupied territories made those intentions concrete. The German soldiers who came eventually to acknowledge the extraordinary quality of the men they were fighting were, in a very real sense, the ones who were seeing clearly. They were the ones for whom the ideology had failed to obscure the reality of the human beings standing across from them, and their reluctant, hard-won acknowledgement of the Soviet soldier's worth is, perhaps, the most honest memorial that group of men ever left. The story of what German soldiers truly thought of Soviet soldiers is ultimately a story about the relationship between ideology and experience, between what we are told to see and what we actually encounter. It is a story about how 4 years of the most extreme human experience imaginable can strip away the comfortable fictions that governments and propaganda systems build around the business of war. And it is a story about the men themselves, on both sides, who endured things that human beings were not designed to endure, and who, in the spaces between the killing, occasionally caught glimpses of each other as the real and complicated human beings they actually were. It is not a comfortable story. It does not have a satisfying resolution. But it is true, and in the catalogue of what the Second World War teaches us about ourselves, it occupies a place that cannot be ignored. From the initial contempt of June 1941, through the unease of that first autumn, through the horror of Stalingrad and the awe of the great Soviet offensives that followed, through the final desperate battles in the rubble of a destroyed civilization, German soldiers' perception of their Soviet opponents underwent a transformation that is one of the most remarkable and revealing psychological journeys in the entire history of warfare. It began with lies and ended with the truth. The truth was that the Soviet soldier was extraordinary. The truth was that no ideology of racial hierarchy could survive an encounter with his reality, and the truth was that Germany paid for its failure to see that truth from the beginning with everything it had. There is one final element of the German soldier's experience of Soviet fighting men that deserves extended attention, and it is perhaps the most intimate and the most human of all the threads we have followed. It concerns the moments of non-combat contact between German and Soviet soldiers, the brief and often paradoxical instances in which men who had been trying to kill one another for weeks or months found themselves in proximity without the immediate imperative of violence, and discovered in those moments something that the war had otherwise done everything possible to suppress. These moments occurred at the front lines during unofficial local truces of the kind that no army ever officially sanctioned, but that occurred whenever conditions created an incentive for both sides to stop killing each other briefly. They occurred during prisoner exchanges. They occurred during the clearing of no man's land to collect the dead, an activity that both sides sometimes conducted in a kind of informal suspension of hostilities that everyone pretended not to notice. And they produced encounters that German soldiers wrote about with a specificity and an emotional honesty that distinguishes them from almost anything else in the documentary record of the Eastern Front. A German soldier in the 267th Infantry Division wrote about such an encounter in January 1943, during a lull, in the fighting near the Don River. A Soviet soldier had crossed into the German lines under a flag of truce to negotiate the retrieval of Soviet dead from the German wire. The negotiation was conducted through a German interpreter, and the Soviet soldier, a sergeant from a Siberian division, had carried himself throughout with a formal dignity that the German who described the encounter found both surprising and impressive. After the practical business was concluded, the two men stood for a moment in the bitter cold, and the Soviet sergeant said something that the interpreter translated as roughly this: "We have been trying to kill each other for a long time. We are both still alive." He said it without apparent irony and without aggression. The German soldier who wrote about this exchange noted that he had not known what to say in response, and that the Soviet sergeant had nodded as if the absence of a reply was itself an answer, and had returned across the snow to his own lines. The German soldier wrote that he had thought about that exchange for weeks afterward. He had thought about what it meant that a man who should, by every measure the war had established, be his mortal enemy, had spoken to him for a moment as simply one soldier speaking to another. He had thought about what the war would look like if that was the framework rather than the one they were actually living in. He had no conclusion. He wrote it down anyway. It is in moments like this one, scattered through the vast documentary record of the Eastern Front like small lights in an enormous darkness, that we see most clearly what German soldiers truly thought of Soviet soldiers at the most fundamental level. Not the ideology, not the professional military assessment, not the propaganda or the contempt or even the grudging admiration, but the simple, persisting, indestructible human recognition that the man on the other side of the wire was a man, that he was cold and tired and afraid and hoping to survive, that he was, underneath everything the war had done to make him into something else, a human being. German soldiers who arrived at this recognition, who allowed themselves to see their Soviet opponents as clearly and honestly as the documentary record shows some of them did, were paying the Soviet soldier the only tribute that ultimately matters. They were seeing him as he was. The memoirs and post-war testimonies of German commanders provide some of the most explicit and considered assessments of what German military professionals truly thought of their Soviet opponents. These accounts were written after the war, sometimes decades after, and they carry both the benefits and the limitations that come with hindsight, and the particular needs of men who were explaining their conduct and defeat to a post-war world. Nevertheless, they are invaluable documents for understanding how German military thinking about the Soviet soldier evolved over the course of the conflict. And in many cases, they are more honest and direct than anything that could have been written during the war itself. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely considered the most gifted operational commander the German army produced, and the man whose memoirs, published under the title Lost Victories, became one of the most influential military books of the 20th century, wrote about Soviet soldiers with a directness and consistency that is all the more striking given his position and reputation. Manstein acknowledged from the outset of his post-war writing that the Soviet soldier was a formidable opponent whose quality had been comprehensively underestimated by German military planners before and during the early stages of the war. He described the Soviet infantryman as uniquely suited to the conditions of the Eastern Front by virtue of his physical endurance, his ability to operate effectively in terrain and weather conditions that reduced German units to immobility, and his capacity to absorb punishment and continue fighting at a level that had no equivalent in any other army Manstein had observed. He noted with particular respect the Soviet soldier's skill in defensive combat, his ability to dig in rapidly and effectively, to use ground in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of his firepower, and to maintain cohesion under fire that would have broken most military formations. Manstein did not write about these qualities with enthusiasm, and he took care throughout his memoirs to argue that German defeats were the result of Hitler's interference in military planning rather than Soviet superiority. But the admiration is there, between the lines and sometimes directly in them. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the German Blitzkrieg and one of the most innovative military minds of the 20th century, was characteristically direct in his post-war assessment of the Soviet soldier and the Soviet military system. Guderian had encountered Soviet armor and Soviet soldiers in person during Operation Barbarossa and in the fighting that followed, and his military judgment was clear. He wrote that Germany had entered the war against the Soviet Union with a catastrophically inadequate understanding of what the Red Army was capable of. He noted that the rapid Soviet recovery from the defeats of 1941, the speed with which the Red Army rebuilt its shattered forces and developed new tactical and operational approaches, was one of the most remarkable military achievements he had observed in a long career. He credited the Soviet soldier specifically with qualities that he had not expected to find, including a tenacity in defense that he compared to nothing else in his experience, and an ability to keep fighting under conditions that should, by every reasonable standard, have ended resistance. He was honest enough in his post-war writing to acknowledge that the outcome of the war in the East was determined not by any inherent German superiority, but by the failure of German planning and the underestimation of an opponent who had proven himself, in the most brutal possible testing ground, to be among the finest soldiers in the world. General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, who served as a staff officer on the Eastern Front and later wrote one of the most read accounts of the fighting, Panzer battles, was equally direct in his assessment. Mellenthin wrote that the Russian soldier was the most formidable defensive fighter he had encountered in any theatre of the war, noting that the Soviet infantryman's ability to create effective defensive positions from almost nothing in conditions of extreme cold and under continuous fire was something that German military training had never prepared soldiers to face. He wrote extensively about the psychological dimension of fighting Soviet troops, noting that the combination of physical endurance, apparent indifference to casualties, and the specific quality of Soviet fighting in built-up areas made urban combat against Soviet forces a uniquely terrible experience. His accounts of fighting in Stalingrad and other urban battles are among the most vivid descriptions in the post-war literature of what it was like to face Soviet soldiers in the close quarters fighting that both sides found most grueling. General Hermann Balck, who commanded armoured forces on the Eastern Front for much of the war and is considered one of the most tactically gifted commanders Germany produced, offered an assessment in his post-war memoirs that cuts through to one of the most fundamental truths about the German-Soviet military encounter. Balck wrote that the Soviet soldier's willingness to die for his country was not, as German propaganda had suggested, a product of coercion or ideological brainwashing. He had observed too many Soviet soldiers fight and die under conditions where coercion was simply not a factor, where no commissar's pistol could have compelled men to do what they were doing, to accept that explanation. He concluded, with the bluntness of a man who had spent years thinking about this, that the Soviet soldier fought with the determination and effectiveness that he did because he was fighting for real things: his land, his people, his family, his way of life. These were not abstractions for the Soviet soldier. They were concrete realities that had been threatened and in many cases destroyed, and the fighting spirit that emerged from that threat was something that no purely military analysis could fully account for. Balck wrote it with respect. He also wrote it with something resembling regret. The post-war German assessment of specific Soviet commanders is also revealing. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many German officers were dismissive of Soviet commanders, attributing Soviet success primarily to material superiority and the willingness to accept casualties that no German commander would have been permitted to take. But as more information became available about what Soviet commanders had actually accomplished, this dismissiveness became increasingly difficult to sustain. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded Soviet forces in some of the most critical battles of the war, including Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and the final assault on Berlin, was recognized by post-war German military analysis as one of the great commanders of the 20th century. His ability to coordinate vast forces across enormous frontages to maintain operational security in the face of German intelligence gathering, and to deliver strategic surprises of the kind that had always been regarded as uniquely a German specialty, impressed German professionals even as they frustrated to acknowledge it. Field Marshal Keitel, who was executed at Nuremberg but had time before his death to leave testimony about the war, admitted that Zhukov had outmaneuvered the German high command in ways that no German general had managed with this degree of consistency. Keitel said this as a professional soldier judging another professional soldier, and in the context of what the statement cost him to make, it carries considerable weight. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, who commanded Soviet forces at Stalingrad and later during Operation Bagration, the greatest Soviet offensive of the war which destroyed Army Group Center in 1944, was another figure who earned specific admiration from German military professionals in the post-war period. The planning and execution of Operation Bagration, which was conducted in the summer of 1944 simultaneously with the Allied landings in Normandy and which resulted in the destruction of over 20 German divisions, was analysed by German military historians as an operation of extraordinary strategic and operational sophistication. The simultaneous attacks on multiple points along a 2,000-kilometre front, the use of deception to convince the Germans that the main attack would come elsewhere, the coordination of air support, artillery, armour and infantry in a way that overwhelmed German defensive capacity at every point simultaneously was, in the post-war German assessment, the finest demonstration of Soviet operational art in the entire war. It was also, by a considerable margin, the most decisive military defeat the German army had ever suffered. But stepping back from the commanders and their post-war assessments to the ordinary German soldier and his experience of the Soviet fighting man, what emerges most powerfully from the documentary record is a story of sustained surprise that became, over 4 years of the most brutal fighting in human history, a profound and unwilling education. The German soldier who crossed the Soviet border in 1941 carrying the certainties of Nazi ideology emerged from the war, if he emerged at all, with a set of convictions about the Soviet soldier that bore no resemblance to what he had believed at the start. He had fought a man who was supposed to be his racial inferior and found him his physical, moral, and increasingly his tactical equal. He had expected to face the disorganized rabble of a collapsing state and found himself confronting one of the most determined and ultimately effective fighting forces in military history. He had come with contempt, and the contempt had been burned away by 4 years of experience that allowed no comfortable distance between ideology and reality. The specific qualities that German soldiers came to identify with the Soviet fighting man over the course of the war form a consistent and remarkable catalogue. There was the physical endurance that seemed to exceed any German soldier's capacity. There was the relationship with the land, with winter, with cold and mud, and the specific terrains of the Soviet countryside that gave Soviet soldiers a home ground advantage that the Germans never managed to replicate. There was the stubbornness in defence that made every prepared Soviet position a miniature fortress requiring extraordinary effort to reduce. There was the quality of the Soviet soldier in close combat, in the urban fighting and the close-range infantry battles where all the advantages of German mobility and firepower were negated, and what mattered was nerve and skill and the willingness to close with the enemy at the shortest possible range. There was the sniper's patience and accuracy. There was the artillerymen's professionalism with weapons that became increasingly terrifying as the war went on. There was the tank crew's willingness to close to point-blank range even at catastrophic cost to themselves to ensure the destruction of their targets. And there was, underlying all of it, the motivation of men who were fighting for something real and immediate and personal, who knew what was at stake and whose commitment could not be diminished by setbacks that would have destroyed any less determined force. German soldiers who spent time as prisoners of war in Soviet custody after the war provide another dimension of experience that informs our understanding of how Germans perceived their former opponents. The conditions of Soviet captivity were, for the most part, extremely harsh, and the death rate among German prisoners in Soviet camps was catastrophic, particularly in the early years before conditions improved. Approximately 1/3 of all German prisoners taken by the Soviets died in captivity. A figure that reflects both the deliberate brutality of certain aspects of the Soviet prisoner system and the general chaos and resource shortage of a country that had been devastated by 4 years of the most destructive war in history. Many German soldiers who experienced Soviet captivity wrote about it with bitterness and trauma that is entirely understandable. But even in these accounts, which are by their nature accounts of suffering and loss, there emerge occasional glimpses of a different kind of observation. Of Soviet guards who treated their prisoners with a basic humanity that conflicted with the expected hatred. Of conversations with Soviet soldiers who talked about their wartime experiences with the directness of men who had lived through the same thing, on the other side of the same front. Of moments of unexpected connection across the vast ideological and cultural gulf that the war had created. One of the most striking elements of the German prisoner experience is what it revealed about the Soviet soldier's relationship to his own past sufferings. German prisoners frequently noted that their Soviet guards and captors were not unaware of what the German army had done in the Soviet Union. They knew about the mass murder of prisoners. They knew about the starvation of Soviet civilians. They knew about the burning of villages and the destruction of cities. In many cases, they had personal experience of these things, with family members who had been killed or homes that had been destroyed. And the reactions of Soviet soldiers to this knowledge were, according to German prisoners who documented them, far more varied and complex than simple collective revenge. Yes, there was violence. Yes, there were atrocities committed against German prisoners in Soviet custody. But there were also Soviet soldiers who, knowing what they knew and having seen what they had seen, extended basic human decency to their prisoners in ways that the German treatment of Soviet prisoners had made no provision for. German prisoners who survived noted these acts of unexpected humanity with a surprise that, in retrospect, tells us something important about the narrowness of the ideological world they had been living in. They had not expected decency. They had not prepared themselves to encounter it. When they found it, they did not always know what to do with it. The long retreat of the German army that began after Kursk and continued with only brief interruptions until the final battles in Germany itself in 1945 was the context in which the German soldier's evolving perception of his Soviet opponent took its final and most desperate form. The men of the Wehrmacht who were retreating across the Soviet Union and then across Poland and finally into Germany itself in 1944 and 1945 were men who had been fighting for years, who were physically and psychologically exhausted in ways that defy easy description, and who knew with a certainty that no amount of official reassurance could dispel that they were losing. And the Soviet soldiers who were advancing, who were pressing the German retreat with an aggression and an operational competence that had no precedent in the war's early years, were now, in the eyes of the German soldiers retreating before them, something more than an ideologically defined enemy. They were men who had survived worse than anything the Germans had thrown at them, and who were now exacting the consequences. They were, in the frankest language that German soldiers used in their letters of this period, formidable. Simply formidable. What did German soldiers think of Soviet soldiers? The answer, as we have traced it through 4 years of the most brutal conflict in human history, is not a simple one. It changed. It evolved. It was forced by the weight of experience and the pressure of reality to become something more honest and more complicated than anything the ideology had prepared for. It began in contempt, moved through surprise and unease and grudging acknowledgement, and ended, for those who survived to reflect on it, in something that can only be called a form of respect, however reluctant, however complex, however entangled with the memory of all that had been endured on both sides. German soldiers who were still alive in 1945 had spent 4 years being educated in the quality of an enemy that the civilization they represented had told them was barely human. The education had cost them everything. And what they had learned at that terrible price was that the Soviet soldier was capable of feats of endurance, courage, and military effectiveness that no ideology of racial hierarchy could explain or account for. He was, in the end, a man fighting for real things, a man who had proven himself on the most murderous battlefield in history, and nothing that the Third Reich had told its soldiers would ever have prepared them for that truth. The legacy of this conflict, and of the German soldier's ultimately transformed perception of his Soviet opponent, resonates in military history and in human memory to this day. The Eastern Front killed somewhere between 25 and 30 million Soviet citizens, military and civilian combined. Germany suffered losses of approximately 5 to 6 million soldiers killed in action, plus the immeasurable human cost of defeat, occupation, and the long reckoning with what had been done in the name of their nation. The scale of what happened between Germany and the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945 is simply beyond any comfortable measurement. But within that vast and terrible history, the story of what German soldiers came to think of the men they were fighting is one of the most humanly significant threads. It is a story about what happens when ideology collides with reality at the cost of millions of lives. It is a story about the capacity of human beings to endure, to adapt, to fight, and to survive in conditions that should, by any rational measure, have been unsurvivable. And it is, in the most uncomfortable possible way, a story about what it costs to see another human being clearly when you have spent years being told to see something else. The German soldiers who entered the Soviet Union in June 1941, confident of a quick and inevitable victory, discovered something that no briefing, no propaganda, no ideological catechism had prepared them for. They discovered that the people they had been taught to despise were, in fact, among the most remarkable soldiers in the history of human warfare. They discovered this the hard way through 4 years of combat so intense and so costly that the statistics alone are almost incomprehensible. And the transformation in their perception, from contempt to dread to a form of respect that the best of them were honest enough to acknowledge, is one of the most striking examples in all of military history of experience, forcing its way through the barriers of ideology to deliver a truth that ideology had tried to prevent. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves mention, and it is perhaps the most important of all. The Soviet soldiers who faced the German army across the most lethal battlefield in history were not fighting in a vacuum. They were fighting for a specific place, a specific culture, specific people they loved, specific landscapes they had grown up in and expected to grow old in. The extraordinary quality of their resistance, the feats of endurance and courage that so consistently surprised and eventually awed their German opponents, was not produced by ideology alone, though ideology played a role. It was produced by the most basic human motivation of all, the desire to defend what is yours from those who would take it. German soldiers who came to understand this, as the best of them eventually did, had understood something fundamental about the nature of war and about the nature of the human beings they were fighting. They had understood it far too late to change anything, but they had understood it. Well, that is the full story of what German soldiers truly thought of their Soviet opponents across the 4 years of the Eastern Front's unimaginable violence. From the casual contempt of June 1941 to the dread and reluctant admiration of 1945, the transformation in German perception tracks the transformation of the war itself. From what Germany expected to what it actually encountered. From the easy victory that never came to the hard-earned reality of what the Red Army soldier truly was. We hope you found this video informative and that it gave you a deeper understanding of the human dimension of the most devastating conflict in history. If you enjoyed today's topic, make sure to check out our video on what German generals truly thought of the Allied generals, which gives you a fascinating parallel perspective from the other side of Germany's war. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest content on World War II history. We will see you in the next one.